back. It is part 5 of 5 for Flat Stanley by Jeff Brown, chapter 5, and it's called Arthur's Good Idea. Let's go on to our final chapter. For a while, Stanley Lambchop was a famous name. Everywhere that Stanley went, people stared and pointed at him. He could hear them whisper, "Over there, Agnes! Over there! That must be Stanley Lambchop, the one who caught the sneak thieves," and things like that.
That's funny.
But after a few weeks, the staring stopped. People had other things to think about. Stanley did not mind. Being famous had been fun, but enough was enough. And then came a further change, and it was not a pleasant one. People began to laugh and make fun of him as he passed by. "Hello, Super Skinny," they would shout, and even ruder things about the way he looked. That's terrible.
That's mean and cruel.
Stanley told his parents how he felt. "It's the other kids I mostly mind," he said. "They don't like me anymore because I'm different. Flat." "Shame on them," Mrs. Lambchop said. "It is wrong to dislike people for their shapes, or their religion, or for that matter, or the color of their skin." "I know," Stanley said. "Only maybe it's impossible for everybody to like everybody." Well, that is true. Yeah. "Perhaps," said Mrs. Lambchop, "but they can try." Later that night, Arthur Lambchop was woken by the sound of crying. In the darkness, he crept across the room and knelt by Stanley's bed. "Are you okay?" he said. "Go away," Stanley said. "Don't be mad at me," Arthur said. "You're still mad because I let you get tangled the day you were my kite, I guess." "Skip it, will you?" Stanley said. "I'm not mad. Go away." "Please, let's be friends." Arthur couldn't help crying a little too. "Oh, Stanley," he said, "please tell me what's wrong." Stanley waited for a long time before he spoke. "The thing is," he said, "I'm just not happy anymore. I'm tired of being flat. I want to be a regular shape again, like other people. But I'll have to go on being flat forever. It makes me sick." And here they are on their bed.
And being flat is actually important because he could do all those things other people can't do.
That's
he
very
could
true.
Slide under
doors
when they were
Yep. Okay.
And even if a door was locked, he could slide under and unlock it.
"Oh, Stanley," Arthur said. He dried his tears in a corner of Stanley's sheet and could think of nothing more to say. "Don't talk about what I just said," Stanley told him. "I don't want the folks to worry. That would only make it worse." "You're brave," Arthur said. "You really are." He took hold of Stanley's hand. The two brothers sat together in the darkness.
They're brothers?
Being friends. They were still both sad, but each one felt a little better than he had before. And then, suddenly, though he was not trying even to think, Arthur had an idea. He jumped up and turned on the light and ran to the big storage box where toys and things were kept. He began to rummage in the box. Stanley sat up in bed to watch. Arthur flung aside a football and some soldiers and an airplane model and lots of wooden blocks, and then he said, "Aha!" He had found what he wanted, an old bicycle pump. He held it up, and Stanley and he looked at each other. "Okay," Stanley said at last, "but take it easy." He put the end of the long pump hose in his mouth and clammed his lips tightly about it so that no air could escape. "I'll go slowly," Arthur said. "If it hurts or anything, wiggle your hands at me." He began to pump. At first, nothing happened, except that Stanley's cheeks bulged a bit. Arthur watched his hand, but there was no wiggle signal, so he pumped on. Then suddenly, Stanley's top half began to swell. What does swell mean?
No.
To get bigger. It's working, shouted Arthur, pumping away. Stanley spread his arms so that the air could get around inside him more easily. He got bigger and bigger. The buttons of his pajama top burst off. Pop, pop, pop! A moment more, and he was all rounded out. Head and body, arms and legs, but not his right foot. That stayed flat.
Can I see Mommy?
Arthur stopped pumping. It's like trying to do the very last bit of those long balloons, he said. Maybe a shake would help. Stanley shook his foot twice, and with a little whooshing sound, it swelled out to match the left one. There stood Stanley Lambchop as he used to be, as if he had never been flat at all. "Thank you, Arthur," Stanley said. "Thank you very much." The brothers were shaking hands when Mr. Lambchop strode into the room with Mrs. Lambchop right behind him. "We heard you," Mr. Lambchop said. "Up and talking when you ought to be asleep, eh? Shame on—" "George!" said Mrs. Lambchop.
Who's George?
It's Mr. Lambchop. "Stanley's round again." "You're right," said Mr. Lambchop, noticing. "Good for you, Stanley." "I'm the one who did it," Arthur said. "I blew him up." Everyone was terribly excited and happy, of course. Mrs. Lambchop made hot chocolate to celebrate the occasion, and several toasts were drunk to Arthur for his cleverness. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop tucked the boys back into their beds and kissed them, and then they turned out the light. "Good night," they said, and here they are, having hot chocolate and cookies.
How good.
"Good night," said Stanley and Arthur. It had been a long and tiring day. Very soon all the Lambchops were asleep. And that is the end of Flat Stanley. But if you are interested, there are other Flat Stanley books.
Like what?
I know there's a whole bunch of them.
What?
I don't have any on me. Oh, here we go. Flat Stanley Again, Stanley and the Magic Lamp, Invisible Stanley. So there are some other books by Jeff Brown that have the Lambchops in them. If you're interested to check those out, I'm sure you can find them on the online library sites. Maybe you can find them on YouTube. And if I find them, I'll let you know. Thanks.
Thanks for watching our videos.